In the spring of 1719, aboard a captured sloop somewhere between the Bahamas and the Carolina coast, a crew of 73 men did something extraordinary for their time. They voted. Not for a member of parliament or a colonial governor, but for their own captain, their own laws, and the punishments they would inflict upon anyone who broke them. This wasn't a gathering of enlightened philosophers debating natural rights in some London coffeehouse. These were thieves, deserters, escaped slaves, and murderers, men who had rejected every legitimate authority in the Atlantic world. Yet in that moment, as they scratched their marks on a piece of parchment that would become known as Bartholomew Roberts Articles, they were creating something that most civilized nations had never achieved, a genuine social contract where every man's voice carried equal weight. The document began with a simple declaration that would have scandalized European nobility. Every man shall have an equal vote in affairs of moment. What followed wasn't just a set of rules. It was a complete system of justice built from scratch by men who had every reason to believe that justice, as practiced by kings and courts, was a lie told to keep poor men in chains. The paradox of pirate justice emerged from a fundamental problem that European empires had created but refused to solve. By the early 18th century, the Atlantic Ocean had become a vast, ungoverned space where ships could sail for months without encountering any legitimate authority. The great maritime powers all claimed dominion over various sea routes and colonies, yet none could actually enforce their laws beyond cannon range of their fortresses. Royal Navy patrols were sporadic at best, concentrated around valuable trade routes and leaving vast stretches of ocean completely lawless. When Captain Charles Johnson published his General History of the Pirates in 1724, he observed that the seas had become like the roads of England in ancient times, where every man carried weapons for his own protection, for there was no sheriff to call upon. This absence of external authority meant that every ship, whether merchant or pirate, became its own small nation, and every captain a potential tyrant. The difference was that merchant captains derived their authority from distant ship owners and trading companies, backed by legal systems that sailors had no voice in creating. Pirates, by necessity, and eventually by philosophy, had to construct their authority from the consent of the governed, because without that consent, any man could simply murder the captain in his sleep and face no consequences beyond the judgment of his shipmates. This need for internal stability without external enforcement led to the creation of pirate codes, formal written constitutions that predated most democratic documents in the Western world. The most famous of these, the Articles agreed upon by Bartholomew Roberts' crew, contained 11 provisions that governed everything from the division of plunder to the punishment for desertion. But Roberts' Articles weren't the first or the only such document. Captain John Phillips, operating in the Atlantic between 1723 and 1724, established his own articles that included the remarkable provision: "If at any time we meet with a prudent woman, that man that offers to meddle with her without her consent shall suffer present death." This wasn't Victorian chivalry. It was practical recognition that sexual misconduct could destroy crew cohesion faster than any external threat. Similarly, the articles used by Captain George Lowther in 1721 specified that the musicians shall have rest on the Sabbath day only, by right, on all other days, by favor only. Even entertainment was regulated, recognizing that forced labor of any kind, even playing a fiddle, could breed resentment in a community where every man was supposedly equal. These codes emerged from hard experience. Early pirate crews that operated without formal articles often tore themselves apart within months, descending into factionalism and violence that made them easy prey for naval hunters. The genius of these documents lay in their specificity and their enforcement mechanisms. Roberts' Article 4 stated, "The lights and candles should be put out at 8 at night, and if any of the crew desire to drink after that hour, they shall sit upon the open deck without lights." This wasn't arbitrary tyranny, it was fire prevention aboard wooden ships where a single candle could incinerate the entire crew. Article 8 specified that none shall strike another on board the ship, but every man's quarrel shall be ended on shore by sword or pistol. Again, this addressed a critical problem. Fights aboard ship could damage vital equipment or escalate into mutiny, while formal duels on shore channeled violence into controlled, ritualized form. The brilliance was that these rules weren't imposed from above, but agreed upon collectively, with every man signing or marking the document. Captain Howell Davis, who commanded several pirate vessels in 1719 before being killed in an ambush at Principe Island, reportedly told a captured merchant captain that his articles were more sacred than any Bible, because we made them ourselves, and every man here has sworn to them in his own blood. Whether this blood oath was literal or metaphorical, it captured the psychological power of self-imposed law. These men felt bound by rules they'd created far more than by any external authority. The enforcement of these codes required a power structure that was remarkably democratic for its era, yet capable of swift and brutal action when necessary. Unlike naval or merchant vessels where captains held near absolute authority, pirate ships operated on a system of checks and balances that wouldn't have seemed out of place in a political treatise. The captain commanded during battle and navigation, but the quartermaster controlled the distribution of plunder, settled disputes, and often led landing parties. This division of power was deliberate. As one former pirate testified at his trial in 1724, the captain is chosen for his daring and sailing skills, but the quartermaster is chosen for his judgment and fairness, for he must settle our quarrels when blood is hot. The quartermaster also served as the crew's advocate, able to countermand the captain's orders if they violated the articles or threatened the ship's safety. When Captain Edward England wanted to torture a captured slave ship captain in 1720, his quartermaster, Taylor, called a crew vote that overruled England, leading to England's eventual deposition. This incident, recorded in multiple contemporary accounts, demonstrates how the system could actually protect against tyranny even among violent criminals. Below these two elected leaders sat various other positions, each with defined responsibilities but also with the right to participate in crew councils where major decisions were debated. These councils, held regularly on most pirate ships, functioned as primitive parliaments where every man could speak. The Articles of Captain Edward Lowe, one of the most psychopathic pirates of the era, nonetheless specified that all matters of importance shall be put to a vote and the majority shall rule. This democratic principle existed in tension with the brutal punishments the codes prescribed, creating a system where collective decision-making could rapidly transition to collective violence. When Walter Kennedy stole a sloop and significant treasure from Bartholomew Roberts in 1720, the crew voted unanimously for pursuit and punishment, a decision that led to a chase across the Atlantic and would have resulted in Kennedy's public torture had he been caught. The vote wasn't just about justice. It was about affirming the crew's collective identity and their shared commitment to the articles they'd sworn to uphold. This power-sharing arrangement emerged partly from pirate demographics and partly from the traditions of the buccaneers who preceded them. Many early 18th century pirates had served in the Royal Navy, where they'd experienced the arbitrary brutality of naval discipline. Flogging was routine, provisions were regularly embezzled by corrupt officers, and common sailors had no recourse against abuse. Captain Charles Bellamy, commanding a pirate fleet in 1717, reportedly told a captured merchant captain, "They vilify us, the scoundrels do, when there is only this difference. They rob the poor under the cover of law, and we plunder the rich under the protection of our own courage." This speech, recorded by the merchant captain and later published, captures the pirates' own understanding of their justice system as morally superior to the legal systems that had oppressed them. When HMS Greyhound captured a pirate crew off Long Island in 1723, several prisoners testified that they'd joined pirates specifically to escape naval tyranny, with one stating, "Better to serve 1 year under articles than 10 under the lash." This wasn't mere rationalization. Economic historians examining wage records have confirmed that pirate crews typically earned more in a single successful voyage than a merchant sailor could earn in a lifetime, and they earned it under rules they'd agreed to rather than submitted to. The articles also addressed the most contentious issue aboard any ship, the division of plunder. Roberts' Article 1 specified exact shares. The captain received 1.5 shares, the quartermaster 1.25, other officers 1.5, and common crew 1 share each. This seems hierarchical until compared to merchant vessels, where captains might receive 20 times what common sailors earned, or naval vessels, where officers claimed prize money while ordinary seamen received fixed wages regardless of captures. The relative equality of pirate distribution, where even the captain earned only 50% more than the lowest crew member, created powerful incentive for everyone to fight equally hard. Moreover, the articles provided for injured men, with Roberts' Code specifying exact compensation. He that shall have the misfortune to lose a limb in time of engagement shall have $800 from the public stock, with sliding scales for lesser injuries. This was revolutionary. Most merchant and naval sailors who were maimed in service could expect nothing but discharge and begging. Captain Mission, whose possibly fictional story was recounted in Johnson's General History, supposedly established an early form of insurance fund where all plunder was pooled and distributed according to need and injury, creating what amounted to the first workers' compensation system in maritime history. Yet this democratic structure existed solely to enable organized violence and theft. The same articles that guaranteed fair trials also prescribed horrific punishments. Roberts's Article 3 declared that none shall game for money either with dice or cards, with violators subject to Moses' law, 39 lashes on the bare back. Article 5 stated that each man shall keep his piece, cutlass and pistols at all times clean and ready for action, with failure resulting in lost shares of plunder, or worse. These weren't suggestions. They were enforced with a brutality that would have impressed any naval disciplinarian. The difference was that the crew itself voted on punishments, creating collective responsibility for the violence. When a pirate named Philip Roche was tried in London in 1723 for murdering a ship's captain, witnesses testified that Roche had been following the crew's voted decision, making every man aboard technically guilty. This distributed guilt actually strengthened crew cohesion. They were all complicit, all bound together by shared crimes that made return to legitimate society impossible. The pirate codes also had to address the fundamental problem of sustaining a criminal enterprise, recruitment and retention. Unlike armies or navies that could conscript men by force, pirate crews theoretically operated on voluntary association, though the line between volunteering and coercion was often blurred. Many codes included provisions about pressed men, sailors forced to join pirate crews. Roberts' Articles didn't address this directly, but contemporary accounts describe how pirates would capture merchant vessels and give crews a choice: join voluntarily and receive full shares, or be released but marked as cowards. This psychological manipulation was itself a form of enforcement, creating a system where voluntary joining was heavily incentivized. Similarly, the articles had to prevent desertion without creating prison-like conditions that would make piracy intolerable. The solution was draconian punishment for deserters, while simultaneously making pirate life attractive enough that most men wouldn't want to leave. Governor Woodes Rogers, writing from Nassau in 1718, observed that these pirates have created a kind of inverse society, where the very harshness of their laws creates loyalty, for every man knows he shall be treated fairly so long as he abides by their compact. The sun had barely risen over the Caribbean on the morning of the 12th of August 1722, when the crew of Bartholomew Roberts' flagship Royal Fortune assembled on deck for what they called a settling of accounts. A sailor named Thomas Jones stood trembling in the center of a circle formed by 73 of his former companions, his hands bound behind his back with tarred rope. His crime was theft. He had stolen a gold ring from another crew member's sea chest, a violation of Article 2 of Roberts' Code. The quartermaster read the charge aloud. The crew voted unanimously for punishment, and within minutes Jones was stripped naked and lashed to a grating. What followed was Moses' law: 39 lashes administered with a cat-o, 9 tails, each stroke delivered by a different crew member to distribute the guilt. By the 15th lash, Jones had stopped screaming. By the 25th, the flesh of his back hung in ribbons. At 39, he was cut down unconscious and doused with seawater, the salt both cleaning the wounds and intensifying the agony when he revived. He survived, barely, and bore the scars for the rest of his short life, which ended 6 months later when Roberts' ship was destroyed by HMS Swallow. But Jones's flogging wasn't unusual cruelty, it was standard procedure, a carefully calibrated punishment designed to inflict maximum pain and humiliation while keeping the victim alive and capable of working. The pirates had inherited this punishment from the Royal Navy, where it was routine, but they had refined it, democratized it, and turned it into public theater that served purposes far beyond mere discipline. The genius and horror of pirate punishment lay in its theatrical brutality, in the way each method was designed not just to harm the individual victim, but to send shockwaves through the entire crew. Consider keel hauling, perhaps the most dreaded sentence a pirate could face. The procedure was mechanically simple, but physiologically catastrophic. The condemned man would be tied to a rope that passed under the ship's keel from one side to the other. On command, he would be thrown overboard and dragged underneath the hull, pulled by crew members hauling the rope on the opposite side. If the ship was moving, the victim would be dragged against the barnacle-encrusted bottom, thousands of razor-sharp shells shredding his skin like cheese against a grater. If the ship was stationary, he would still have to hold his breath for the 30 seconds to 2 minutes it took to drag him across, his lungs burning, his body scraping against the hull. Most men didn't survive. Those who did emerged transformed, skin flayed, often missing fingers or ears torn off by barnacles, sometimes blinded by salt water forced into their eyes at pressure, always traumatized beyond measure. Captain William Snellgrave, captured by pirates off the Gold Coast in 1719, witnessed a keel hauling and later wrote that the man's screams could be heard even underwater, a gurgling shriek that turned the stomachs of the hardest sailors. The victim in Snellgrave's account, a pirate named George Wilson, who had been caught stealing from the common chest, survived the ordeal but was so mutilated that he died from infection 3 days later, his last hours spent in delirium, clawing at his own ravaged flesh. What made keel hauling particularly effective as a deterrent was its rarity and its precision. Pirates didn't keel haul for minor infractions. This punishment was reserved for the gravest violations: mutiny, murder of a shipmate, or major theft from the common stock. The infrequency made it legendary. Every pirate knew the stories, but few had actually witnessed it, which allowed the punishment to grow in imagination until it became a mythic horror. When Captain Edward Lowe's articles specified that he that shall violate the common stock shall be keel-hauled and then marooned, the threat derived its power not from regular use, but from the absolute certainty that if invoked, it would be carried out with remorseless precision. Lowe himself, one of the most sadistic pirates of his era, reportedly keel-hauled only 3 men during his entire career from 1,721 to 1,724, but the threat of it kept his crew of over 200 men in line. Moreover, keel-hauling had been inherited from the Dutch Navy, where it was called keelhalen, and its use by pirates represented a deliberate appropriation of legitimate naval authority. By employing the same punishments as warships, pirates were making a statement. We are as legitimate as any navy, our justice as real as any court. The psychological dimension of punishment reached its apex in marooning, a sentence that combined physical privation with crushing isolation and the slow, creeping certainty of death. The standard practice, codified in most pirate articles, was to abandon the condemned man on a small, uninhabited island or sandbar with minimal supplies. Typically, a bottle of water, a pistol with a single shot, and sometimes a small portion of salt pork or hardtack. The pistol served a dual purpose. It could potentially be used for hunting, but more commonly it was meant for ending one's own life when the water ran out and death by dehydration became inevitable. Alexander Selkirk, the real-life inspiration for Robinson Crusoe, survived being marooned for 4 years on Maza Tierra Island off Chile from 1,704 to 1,709. But Selkirk was marooned by a legitimate merchant captain, not pirates, and his island had fresh water, goats, and vegetation. Pirates chose their marooning sites specifically for their barrenness. Captain Charles Vane was marooned by his own crew on a tiny island in the Bay of Honduras in November 1718 after losing a vote of confidence. The island, barely 100 yards across, had no fresh water and only sparse vegetation. Vane survived for months by catching rainwater in his boots and eating raw crabs, but his rescue was pure chance. An old buccaneer acquaintance named Holford happened to spot him. Most marooned men weren't so fortunate. Philip Ashton, marooned by pirates on Roatan Island off Honduras in 1723, left one of the few first-hand accounts of the experience. Ashton, actually a captive who had refused to sign pirate articles, was left with even less than the usual supplies, just a knife and his clothes. His narrative, published in 1725, describes 16 months of near starvation, during which he survived on raw shellfish, berries, and eventually the companionship of another castaway, a Mosquito Indian who taught him to hunt. Ashton wrote that the solitude was worse than the hunger, for a man alone begins to doubt his own existence, and I would speak aloud simply to hear a human voice, even if it was only my own. This psychological torment was precisely the point. Marooning wasn't just execution, it was exile from human society, a return to primitive existence that affirmed the crew's power to cast men out from their artificial community back into nature's indifference. When Benjamin Hornigold marooned several of his crew on a barren cay near the Bahamas in 1717 for attempting to steal a longboat, he was making a statement about the boundaries of the pirate social contract. Betray the crew, and you cease to be human. You become merely an animal waiting to die. The physical punishments operated on a different register, transforming the body itself into a text that could be read by others. Moses's law, the 39 lashes inherited from biblical tradition and naval practice, was the most common punishment for offenses like fighting, drunkenness, or dereliction of duty. The cato, 9 tails, the whip used for these beatings, was designed to maximize pain while minimizing permanent damage. Each of its 9 cords was knotted at intervals, and the knots would catch and tear the flesh with each stroke. But pirates didn't stop at flogging. For more serious or repeated offenses, they employed mutilations that permanently marked the offender. Ear cropping was common for theft, with one or both ears sliced off depending on the severity. Nose slitting, where the cartilage was cut vertically, marked cowards who had fled during battle. These mutilations served practical purposes beyond punishment. They made the victim immediately identifiable to other pirates and prevented him from easily returning to legitimate society, where such disfigurement would mark him as a criminal. When Captain Edward Lowe captured a merchant vessel in 1723 and discovered that the captain had thrown a bag of coins overboard, he didn't simply kill the man. Instead, he ordered the captain's lips cut off and cooked in front of him, then forced the captain to watch as his ship was burned with his entire crew locked below decks. Lowe then murdered the captain and left his mutilated body floating as a warning. This wasn't madness. It was calculated terror designed to ensure that future merchant captains would surrender their valuables rather than attempting to hide or destroy them. Branding was another form of permanent marking, though less common among pirates than in legitimate navies or among slave owners. Some pirate crews would brand deserters who were recaptured with a D on the forehead or cheek, ensuring they could never again blend into normal society. Captain John Gow, operating in the North Sea in 1725, reportedly branded a crew member who had attempted to betray them to authorities with the word traitor across his chest, using a red-hot iron from the ship's galley. The man survived, but bore the mark for the rest of his life, dying on the gallows alongside Gow in London later that year. The branding served multiple purposes. It punished the individual, it warned others, and it created a permanent outcast who had no choice but to remain loyal to pirate life, since legitimate society would never accept him. The myth of walking the plank has overshadowed the reality of pirate executions, despite having almost no basis in historical fact. The image of a blindfolded prisoner forced at sword point to walk off a plank extended over the side of the ship is almost entirely a creation of 19th century literature and theatre. There are virtually no contemporary accounts from the golden age of piracy that describe this practice. What did exist were various methods of forcing prisoners overboard, sometimes simply throwing them into the sea, sometimes making them jump while the crew fired muskets at them for sport, sometimes tying weights to their feet and pushing them over the rail. But the formal plank ritual appears to be fictional, likely invented by writers who wanted a more theatrical version of execution at sea. The reason the legend persisted is revealing. It fits perfectly with the theatrical nature of pirate culture. Walking the plank has the formal structure of a ritual execution, combining drama with a perverse kind of agency. The victim must take his own final steps toward death. This appealed to the 19th century Romantic imagination's vision of pirates as dark theatrical performers. What actually happened aboard pirate ships was often more brutal and less ceremonial. Executions were typically swift and pragmatic. Hanging from the yardarm was the most common method for serious crimes like mutiny or murder of a shipmate. The condemned would have a noose placed around his neck, the rope would be thrown over the yardarm, and crew members would haul him up, leaving him to strangle. This wasn't the carefully calculated drop-and-break-the-neck execution of later judicial hangings. It was slow strangulation that could take 5 or 10 agonizing minutes. Captain Bartholomew Roberts executed several of his own crew this way, and the bodies would often be left hanging for days as the ship continued sailing, serving as constant reminders to the remaining crew. When Roberts captured a slave ship in 1721 and discovered that several enslaved people had attempted to revolt during the capture, he had them hanged from the yardarm but made the execution worse by hanging them in groups of 3 or 4 from the same rope, so their combined weight ensured faster death for some, while others strangled more slowly. The African captives' bodies were left hanging for a week as Roberts sailed along the coast, displaying them to other potential captors as a warning about resistance. For particularly hated victims, or those deemed to have committed unforgivable offenses, pirates employed execution methods that combined death with humiliation. Gunpowder executions involved tying a man to the mast, placing a keg or bag of gunpowder at his feet, laying a fuse, and lighting it. The explosion would typically blow off the victim's legs, leaving him to bleed out on deck while the crew watched. Captain Edward Lowe used this method on a New England fishing captain in 1723 after the man insulted him, and contemporary accounts describe how Lowe made the man's crew watch the execution before releasing them to spread the story. Another method involved sewing a victim into a canvas sack weighted with cannonballs and throwing him overboard, a practice that seems to have been more common than walking the plank, though less theatrical. This had the advantage of disposing of the body completely, leaving no evidence, which was sometimes strategically important. When pirate captain Christopher Moody captured a ship in 1718, he executed several prisoners this way, and only the testimony of one escaped crew member provided evidence of the murders at Moody's eventual trial. The most psychologically devastating executions involved making the victim complicit in his own death. Some pirate crews would force a condemned man to draw lots with his executioner. If he drew the short straw, he would be shot. If he drew the long straw, he would do the shooting. This perverse lottery distributed guilt throughout the crew while simultaneously giving the victim false hope until the final moment. Captain George Lowther's crew employed this method in 1722 when executing a man accused of cowardice during battle. The accused drew the short straw, but before he was shot, the crew made him load the musket that would kill him and hand it to his executioner. These rituals of complicity served to bind the entire crew to the punishment, making every man a participant rather than merely a witness. It also reinforced the democratic nature of pirate justice. Even in execution, there was a vote, a lottery, a process that involved everyone and thus implicated everyone in the outcome. When Captain Edward Lowe captured the Portuguese vessel Nostra Senhora de Victoria off the Azores in 1723, he didn't merely plunder its cargo of gold and sugar. After discovering that the ship's cook had thrown a bag of coins overboard rather than surrender it, Lowe ordered the man's lips cut off and broiled before his eyes, then forced the crew to watch as he murdered the cook in front of them. This wasn't random savagery. It was calculated psychological warfare, a message written in blood that would ripple across every tavern, dock, and quarterdeck, from Lisbon to the Caribbean. Lowe understood something fundamental about human nature. The fear of what might happen often controls people more effectively than what actually does. The psychology of pirate punishment operated on multiple levels, creating a web of terror that extended far beyond the immediate victim. Aboard a pirate vessel, where 50 to 100 men lived in impossibly close quarters for months at sea, the threat of brutal punishment served as invisible shackles. Every sailor knew the stories. They'd heard about Thomas Anstis's crew nailing a man's feet to the deck before shooting him. They'd listened to whispered accounts of Blackbeard forcing a subordinate to eat his own severed ears. These weren't just warnings, they were psychological conditioning, teaching men that the price of betrayal, cowardice, or theft wasn't merely death, but something far worse. A death so agonizing and public that it would serve as entertainment and education for the survivors. The brilliance of this system lay in its efficiency. A captain like Bartholomew Roberts, who commanded over 400 men across multiple vessels at his peak in 1721, couldn't personally supervise every sailor. He relied instead on the haunting memory of past punishments to maintain order across his fleet. When Roberts' articles specified that deserters would be marooned with 1 bottle of water, 1 pistol with powder and shot, the psychological weight of that single sentence did more work than a dozen guards. Each man who signed those articles internalized that threat, carried it with them through every watch, every storm, every moment of temptation. This weaponization of fear created something unexpected, loyalty born from shared trauma. Modern psychologists recognize this phenomenon in extreme groups, where the very severity of initiation rituals and punishments binds people together. Pirates experienced this intensely. Having witnessed a keel-hauling together, having stood shoulder to shoulder as a man screamed his last breaths after Moses's law, crews developed a twisted form of solidarity. They became complicit in the violence, which paradoxically made them more committed to the pirate life. To abandon ship wasn't just to flee danger, it was to admit that the atrocities they'd witnessed and perhaps participated in had been for nothing. The legendary Captain Charles Vane understood this dynamic perfectly. In 1718, when his quartermaster Jack Rackham challenged his authority after Vane refused to attack a French warship, Vane didn't immediately resort to violence. Instead, he orchestrated a vote among the crew, knowing that the public nature of the decision would force men to declare their loyalties openly. When Vane lost and was marooned with 15 supporters, the act itself became a demonstration of pirate justice, a punishment that was simultaneously democratic and terrifying, showing that even captains weren't immune to the codes they enforced. But the true genius of pirate punishment extended far beyond individual ships. These stories traveled. They moved through the maritime world with the speed and mutation of folklore, growing more elaborate and horrifying with each retelling. A merchant captain who surrendered quickly after seeing a black flag might justify his decision to ship owners by recounting exaggerated tales of pirate brutality, tales that, whether entirely accurate or not, served the pirates' purposes perfectly. When Blackbeard blockaded Charleston Harbor in 1718, he achieved his goals partially through reputation alone. The city's elite had heard the stories, absorbed the legends, and chose not to test whether they were true. This reputation management was deliberate. Pirates like Edward Teach actively cultivated their terrifying images, with Blackbeard famously weaving smoking fuses into his enormous beard before battle, appearing like a demon emerging from hellfire. These theatrical flourishes worked in concert with genuine brutality to create an aura of supernatural dread. A merchant crew that believed they faced inhuman monsters was far more likely to surrender without resistance, which actually reduced bloodshed while increasing pirate success rates. The threat of extreme punishment became more valuable than its execution. The psychological impact rippled through generations. Royal Navy officers who had never encountered pirates personally nonetheless structured their own disciplinary codes partly in response to pirate methods. The British Admiralty recognized that harsh naval discipline needed to be consistent and somewhat predictable to prevent sailors from viewing piracy as an attractive alternative. In this strange way, pirate punishment systems influenced legitimate maritime law, creating a dark dialogue between legal and illegal seafaring worlds. What made pirate punishments particularly haunting was their performative nature. These weren't private executions hidden in dungeons. They were public spectacles staged on deck, often with the entire crew summoned to witness. When Philip Lyne's crew tried and executed their own captain for cowardice in 1726, they did so with formal proceedings that mimicked legitimate courts, complete with testimony and deliberation. This theatrical quality served multiple purposes. It legitimized the punishment through democratic procedure, it distributed guilt among all witnesses, and it created a shared memory that would bind the crew together through collective trauma. The stories became legend precisely because they contained truth wrapped in exaggeration. Modern historians confirm that keel-hauling, marooning, and Moses's Law were all documented practices, even if walking the plank remains largely mythical, is less than #0. 4# is greater than, but the line between fact and fiction mattered less than the cultural impact. By the 1720s, when the golden age of piracy was ending, the psychological infrastructure pirates had built outlasted the pirates themselves. The terror they'd cultivated continued sailing long after most pirate crews had been captured or killed, living on in literature, law, and the nightmares of sailors who whispered stories in darkened forecastles about what happened to men who crossed the wrong captain on the wrong day in waters where no nation's laws could protect them. And so, as the sun sinks below the crimson horizon, our tale of daring seas and restless souls comes to an end. From Blackbeard's fiery beard in 1718 to Anne Bonny's fierce defiance in Nassau, the age of the pirates has drifted into legend, but their echoes still haunt every crashing wave. They were rebels, dreamers, and survivors, bound not by a nation, but by the whisper of the wind and the promise of freedom. As the old saying goes, a smooth sea never made a skilled sailor. So, may your compass always point true, your rum never run dry, and your stories always reach safe harbor. Until next tide, mates, fair winds and following seas.